There's a child murderer in the corner of every room I enter. Through the thin trail behind the backyard fence of my old house, concealed by damp trees tall as cranes and soaked in years of rot, there are the remains of some sort of wooden structure. It smells like death, and even during the aridest months of the year, the upright planks are soggier than ever and have those wobbly wrinkles you get on the tips of your fingers after a long bath. For the less than a week that I lived in that house, there would always be a shadow in the corner of every room I entered. The shadow was roughly humanoid, the silhouette at least. Not its eyes. Its eyes were a long hollow black, boring into me, seeing beyond me. Sometimes when I was far away, like at my friend Mark's house, it wouldn't follow me. But I knew it was there when I heard it breathing. I bought my old house, I say old, because I no longer live there, for a remarkably cheap price. The previous owner couldn't wait to get rid of it. I named a price of scarcely 5 digits, and he threw the house keys into my hand and closed it with his 2 stained ones. He looked at me through those typical Irish eyebrows and pursed his lips in a desperate smile, as if he were thanking me for taking the house. He left in his blue tin can truck as soon as I stuck the key into the front door. The house was already furnished and in a state healthy enough for me to spend plenty of time there without renovation. I went snooping around the halls, newly painted with a warm white, unlike those dystopian modern houses with such dismal bluish whites, and found the backyard. The grass was autumn brown, and the wooden fence was a matching amber. I went through the stretch of woods behind the house, and that's where I found the ruins. I was immediately disturbed. The sky was an appropriate gray, and I felt like I wasn't alone in those woods. As the large-framed adult male I am, I still felt completely vulnerable. But what would have scared me most at the time would not have been a human threat. I could sense something beyond human, like human. I got the hell out of there. But that feeling that I was being watched never left. I first heard the breathing in the furthermost corner of the living room that night. I was sleeping on the pull-out couch. In my brief sleep inertia, still unable to differentiate dream from reality, I mumbled hello into the stale mid-year air. As soon as I realized there was somebody standing in the corner of the room, I jumped to my feet and stared at it. "Who the fuck are you?" I barked, more awake than I was yesterday midday. I clutched the corkscrew on the counter next to me and flicked the light switch. I now had a completely lucid view of whatever was standing right there. I think I would have preferred it to be an armed intruder at the time, because I knew that this shadow was worse than anything I could have imagined. I rang up my friend Mark and spent the night at his house. "You going to explain what happened last night?" Mark asked with a hoarse undertone. He jammed his palm into the corner of his eye socket and rubbed. It was morning time, and I could tell Mark was a little pissed about the whole thing. He's never been an emotionally present kind of guy, and in a way, I think that's why I love being around him so much. He grounds me, brings me back to earth. Unlike so many of my other friends who respond to my discontentedness with a bouquet of lies to console me. "No," I say dully. "Why? You'd think I'm crazy." "I already do." We chuckle a bit, and before I can object, I'm being stuffed into my green Toyota. It's a humble car, small, and still smells new. Mark and I wave goodbye, and he slides his flat hands into his pockets as he shrinks in the distance. Halfway home I heard the breathing. "It's in the backseat." The words hissed in my head like a hot iron branding. I couldn't look in the backseat mirror, not because I was scared to see if it was there, but I was scared to see if it had changed, if somehow it's worse than before. I had to sleep in the house that night. Mark would have been irate if I had invited myself over again. I couldn't think of anything but that thing as I mindlessly scrolled through my phone. I refused to look at it, but I think it was lustful for my attention. After an hour it was a foot from my face. The following morning I booked a visit to a nearby psychic. I'd never believed in anything beyond evolution before this, so I felt alien to the spiritual community. Seeing a psychic seemed like the most appropriate consultation, as I'm not sure that shadow is alive. If that's what psychics specialize in and not mediums. I walked 7 miles to get there. I didn't want that thing to appear in my backseat again. She was tall, the psychic, and dressed modestly. Beads adorned her bony wrists, and they jangled as she beckoned me to the back room. The reading room, as she called it. She wasn't one of those stereotypical psychics, old and drowning in brooches and jewels, but you could definitely tell she was witchy. She pulled out the chair opposing her office-like desk and swiftly took her own seat, motioning for me to sit down. I sat down across from her and gawked at the bones and little herb jars in front of me. "You paid for a general reading. Those are for future predictions and to help you get a better sense of your life right now," she purred with a smirk. "I did," I respond earnestly, knowing full well that I had no idea what the choices meant, only that I felt seeing a psychic in general was enough. "Are you sure that was the right choice? Why do you ask? I sense that a general reading is not why you came here." And how do you know that? I take it easily, edging on the subject, in case psychics don't actually deal with shadows that follow you around everywhere. You have a friend, she said with a coy smile, and pointed to the corner of the room. Behind me. I was almost relieved that she could see it. I didn't follow to where she pointed, and instead I looked down at the supplies in front of me. She whisked them away with a clean scoop, counted the bones, and put them aside. She looked at me, took my hands in hers, looked down, and adjusted her posture as a sort of preparation or confirmation that whatever she does was about to start. She whispered something softly, soft enough that I couldn't understand. She had a mysterious glow about her, almost a dark glow that you couldn't pick up with your eyes, but could somehow smell it. She was alluring, in the mystical sense. You have quite the entity with you, she said. Entity? What entity? I asked, unnerved. She spat a little shh at me, and continued. She jolted, and stared at me with the ugliest face I've ever seen. Eyes locked open, pupils staring right at my chest. The most intense grimace. That is a monster. You are dealing with evil. That is one of the most intense forces I've ever come across. That thing has been responsible, or worked with the force that has ended many innocent lives, naive ones, defenseless ones. What? Kids. It killed kids. Children. Oh, my God. She looked visibly distressed, eliminating the elite professionalism I had just seen in her. How do I get rid of it? I said, ramping into a panicked yell. You get rid of the reason it's there. Have there been any changes in your life recently? A new person you're dating or the death of a loved one? She articulated, not to me, but to my eyes. I moved into a new house a few days ago. I posed. Her eyes dropped and her face sagged, almost like somebody sucked the blood from her body and now she's a pile of bones and flesh. Get out. I spent the next few days packing what I unleashed in that house, furiously stuffing all of my clothes into various bags, and losing my temper when I had to redo it, because it meant that I had to spend more time in that house. The breathing from that shadow never stopped. Eventually it became ambient noise, but it still persisted tirelessly. Sometimes I stared at the shadow in repulsion, but eventually had to look away because it disturbed me too much. Sometimes I censored it with my hand, especially when I was going to the toilet or showering. I knew I absolutely had enough when I had a dream of a little girl standing in those rotten ruins behind the house. Her outfit was stained with a lick of dirt, and I just felt horrible for her. I think it was my mind conjuring the image of whatever would dismay me most at the time, but I took it as a sign. When morning rose, I threw myself out of the house and marched to that strip of woods with the wooden ruins, and kicked down the foundations. A cloud of dust and rot exploded every time I made an impact with a plank. But it didn't stop me. My black jeans transitioned to a putrid gray, splotchy, and in some parts, white. I let my feelings loose and disfigured whatever was left until it was a dent of fungus and decay. My tears did nothing to the already saturated soil. It is borderline humiliating having to deal with this. Having some shadow antagonize you the moment you move into a brand new house. This is the first real house I've ever bought, and it felt like I was throwing myself into the atrocities of adulthood. The adulthood of regime and routine and the monotonous click-clacking of the keyboards in the mundane office job I was inexorably bound to work in. The adulthood where phones ringing sound like birds chirping compared to the chatter of the downtown cars, or the silence of rural country. I should be thrilled to be a homeowner. How little people get to have one of those nowadays. I knew that the odds of me getting a house was slim to none. But when I saw the listing, my eyes gleamed and I heard a twinkle from my bank account, full of my teenage retail money that I refused to spend all throughout the time I was making it. It was instinct calling on a paradigm mother and mark drilled into me. I followed the ruins, sinking into the directionless woods, kicking down every plank until I reached flat land. The trees didn't thin, but the grass was much shorter, and the sound of the streets was drowned out by the rustling above. And that's when I saw it. The most vile thing I have ever seen and ever will see. A sprout of blonde hair coming from a concave in the earth, stapled to the dirt by treacherous rains and whatever animals may have trampled over it. I looked around, barely conscious, and scattered around were 4 more disturbed concaves in the ground. They must have once been holes, but were filled. Human-shaped holes. Small human-shaped holes. The police tracked the culprit down by the 5th week after I made the call. He had owned the house before the guy who sold me the house. Sometimes that bit of blonde hair floats up behind my cup of tea or in my lunchtime sandwich, and I'm suddenly not in the mood to eat anymore. Sometimes I step in a ditch outside of my new house, far, far away, and think that I just stepped on a dead kit underneath the soil. Sometimes I can't sleep thinking about what those ruins may have been when they were once a structure. But I think now I'm ready to talk about everything that happened. It seems like the only thing I really can do at this stage. And I have questions, a lot of questions, some about the house, most about that shadow.